All right, welcome to Faith and Culture Now. Today we are joined by Rabbi Elana Zelony. So Rabbi Zelony, thank you so much for being here. And
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Today we're going to be talking about conservative Judaism and some of the basic beliefs and tenets of conservative Judaism. So I just wanted to ask if you would start by briefly defining Judaism for us as you see it.
Sure. Judaism is a religion that started 4,000 years ago when God spoke to the prophet Abraham and asked him to abandon idolatry and to share the idea of monotheism with the world. And since then, Jews have lived all over the world through all different periods in history. But the basic tenet is still the same, that we follow God's commandments.
Very good. And what are some of the major beliefs of conservative Judaism?
Well, we believe in one God,
Mm-hmm.
and that God is the creator of the universe, that God redeemed our people from Egypt and will redeem our people again in the future with Mashiach, the Messiah. And we believe that God delivered the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai and brought the people to the promised land.
Very good. And you mentioned a second ago the idea of sort of following God's commands. What are some of the commands that you would follow?
So there are 613 commandments that can be found in the Torah. They are different kinds. Some of them are ethical.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we have in common with the Christians the 10 utterances. We call them the 10 utterances instead of the 10 commandments because for us, the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not a commandment, it's a statement.
Sure.
But so we have that in common with Christianity. And so we don't steal. Well, we are commanded not to steal, to
Sure.
murder, to commit adultery. There are ethical commandments, but then we also have ritual commandments.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we keep kosher. We refrain from eating certain foods or certain combinations of foods. We honor the Sabbath, and so we refrain from activities on the Sabbath like traveling, using money or technology.
Mm-hmm.
But what I find is if you look into the ritual commandments deeply, they actually lead you to ethical commandments. So, for example, the commandment not to eat pig, on
Mm-hmm.
the one hand, it could be seen as arbitrary. But on the other hand, learning to be mindful about what I put into my mouth may help me be mindful about what comes out of my mouth when I speak. And it can also help me be more thoughtful about consumption
Mm-hmm.
and what I consume as a human and the impact that that has on my fellow humans and the environment.
Yeah.
So I believe that though we have ethical and ritual commandments, the ritual commandments are daily opportunities to consider the ethical.
Sure. You probably argue that or say that all the commandments God's given are for our benefit, and ultimately they all are meant to help draw us better into walking with God in his will and in fellowship with him.
That's exactly it.
Very good. Well, what would you say about what text you consider to be holy text or scriptural text?
Sure. The Torah is the most sacred text. That's the first 5 books of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so while we're on the subject of the Bible, that's another book that Jews and Christians have in common. But our Bible doesn't include the Gospels or the epistles.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to be culturally sensitive, Jews don't love it when you refer to the Bible as the Old Testament, because from our perspective, there's nothing old about it. There wasn't a New Testament. So if you want to be culturally sensitive, you can refer to it as the Jewish Bible when you're talking about the portion of the Bible that doesn't include the Gospels and epistles.
Yeah.
So that's the Torah, the first 5 books. We read those in an annual cycle every year. And then we read the rest of the Bible as well, but it's not a central part of the reading on the Sabbath. And equally important, although somewhat less divine in authorship, is the Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
And so Judaism underwent an evolution about the same time that Christianity was forming. Under the Roman occupation, with the destruction of the temple, Judaism was at a crossroads, which is okay, well, there's no temple. We can just dissolve, or we can reinvent the way that we relate to God. And so they went with option B, and we developed what's called Rabbinic Judaism. So just like Christianity has been through evolutions with the Nicene Conference or the Protestant Reformation, Judaism went through an evolution at that time period, and they started writing down the interpretations that the rabbis wanted to give God's Bible. And those texts form 30, I can't remember, it's like 37, 38 volumes of the Talmud of rabbinic literature that is really just as important in the way that we live our Judaism as the Torah and the Bible.
Yeah, it's almost like a commentary on the Hebrew scriptures, right?
That's exactly right. You know, the Torah says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk.
Right.
And then the rabbis come along and say, well, what exactly does that mean? And in the end, they determine, okay, well, we shouldn't eat milk and meat products together, and we should keep separate dishes for those products, as an example of how they interpret the Bible.
Yeah, that makes sense. So very good. Well, I know you are a conservative rabbi, and by the way, for people watching this video, I believe the first female conservative rabbi to have her own temple in North Texas, or all of Texas.
All of Texas. That is true. That is true.
Yeah. But so with that in mind, what are some differences between, say, conservative Judaism versus, say, Orthodox or traditional Judaism? Or
Well,
what makes you distinctive, you know?
yeah. So in the United States, there are three major branches or flavors of Judaism. Orthodox is the most traditional, conservative is somewhat in the middle, and reform is the least traditional. So by traditional, in a more traditional congregation, the service would be entirely in Hebrew. The sermon would be in English, and we usually provide English translation in our prayer books and our Torah reading for that morning. But okay, so traditional, the more Hebrew you hear, the more traditional the congregation. Traditional congregations observe the Sabbath, keep kosher, and the more traditional the congregation, the more restricted the roles of women and those with disabilities are in the congregation.
That makes sense. And so with as you move from traditional to more conservative, there's more English and there's less restriction. What about with regard to, you said something about disabilities, there's more restrictions?
Yes, so in a Reform congregation, there would be no problem with someone who was deaf or blind or lame leading the congregation in prayer or reading from the Torah. In an Orthodox congregation, you would be less likely to find those things to be true because there's more of a sense of, well, you should ask an Orthodox rabbi that question.
Sure.
And also the role of women. So in my community, while it's not as common for women to lead the congregation in prayer or read from the Torah or take positions of authority in our communities, there are women in positions of leadership, and you see more women in positions of leadership in the Reform movement, and very few women having positions of leadership in the Orthodox movement. It's also important to say that Orthodox congregations come in different flavors. So we would say ultra-Orthodox versus modern Orthodox. And an ultra-Orthodox community is usually completely withdrawn from the world in which they live.
Hmm.
They go to their own schools, they shop in their own stores. They might live in New York City, but they have very little interaction with the world around them. Whereas a modern Orthodox person might keep all of the traditions of keeping kosher and honoring the Sabbath, but they would work a job just like any other American, and they would
Hmm.
be out in the same grocery stores and schools as other Americans.
Yeah, very good. Well, what would be some things that would make someone want to become a practitioner or a convert to Judaism?
We have beautiful rituals. I love lighting the Sabbath candles with my family once a week.
Hmm.
It's just a moment that's sacred and reminds us that there is light and joy in the world.
Hmm.
Judaism is also permissive of doubt and wrestling with our theology. And many of us find that appealing, that it's okay. It's okay to question God, and it's okay to question the authorities that are interpreting God's laws for the community. Judaism has a lot of festivals. We have about one a month. So I
Okay.
like that because there's always something to celebrate. I really like that every week we get a Sabbath. Turning off my phone and my computer for 25 hours is such a gift in this world.
Hmm.
Uh, because it allows me to focus on my relationship with God and the people that I'm closest with, my family, my friends, and my community. It really helps me take a break. So those are aspects of Judaism that I think might be appealing to people.
Yeah, sure. When I teach a class on spiritual foundations, one of the things I require my students to do is take a fast from technology for one day
How
during
does
this
it go?
semester.
What
And
what
you'd
do
be
you hear?
surprised. Oh, so many of them are saying, "Oh, that was so difficult. I don't know. I didn't think I could make it through." And but it
Well,
is important. It's really important just to sort of rest your mind and
yeah,
sort of take a step back. You also mentioned the idea of being able to wrestle with your faith and your theology, and it reminds me of so many of the prophets in the Hebrew scriptures who question God's decisions or question what God told them to do, and they have these conversations. And in all of these conversations, especially Jeremiah is one I'm thinking of more specifically, right? He has all these conversations with God, and God converses back with him and doesn't say, "How dare you question me?" He says, most of the time, he says, "Jeremiah, you need to be patient. I'm working this out, but I'm doing it in my time, not your time." But it is important to be able to wrestle with belief. I think um, part of any spiritual foundation really should be the idea or the ability to struggle with your belief, because um, you can't really make it your own without that struggle.
right. For me, an element of faith is doubt.
Mhm.
Uh, you touched on with the conversations between Jeremiah and God, another concept that's important in Judaism, which is we believe we are in covenant with God, in partnership with God.
Mhm.
Because a covenantal relationship, while it's very clear that there is a dominant, more powerful party, there are things that God owes to us and that we owe to God.
Mhm. No, it makes sense. I see throughout the whole Hebrew text, God saying, honor me in this way and do this, but I will do this. And he binds himself in most of the covenants that you find in the scriptures to, no matter what, whether the people are faithful or not, God has said, this is my part of the covenant and I'm not going to break it.
Right. And in a covenantal relationship, you can have a conversation about the contract. In fact, the covenant is renewed within the Torah itself. We see a covenant originally with Abraham, then
Hmm.
we see it again with the people at Sinai, and then we see it again when they're about to enter the promised land in the book of Deuteronomy. The covenant between God and the people evolves, it's negotiable.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think you even see, even again when David becomes king, you see additional
Yes.
evolving in the covenant there as well. So, yeah, that makes sense.
And that's actually another distinction between Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews.
Mm-hmm.
We differ as to who gets to interpret the covenant, who is empowered to make those decisions, and how quickly can those decisions change, and
Mm-hmm.
how do we address new things that come along. So, for example, the the people of the Bible and the people of the Talmud never had to discuss how technology would affect the Sabbath because it didn't
Yeah.
exist. And conservative Jews tend to be more adaptive and make decisions that are at a faster pace of change. And the Orthodox community tends to move more slowly on those decisions.
Yeah. That seems like that would be pretty logical for that to be the case. So, yeah, very good. Well, what are some things that might prevent someone or be a stumbling block for someone considering Judaism?
I think the biggest stumbling block in the United States, at least, is Judaism is all about emphasizing the needs of the community over the needs of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And in the United States, we really value individual freedoms and rights. And that can be hard for someone entering the Jewish faith to accept, that it's
Yeah.
all about the needs and the welfare of the community rather than the individual.
Yeah, that sort of is the same way with Christianity here in the United States. Christianity, just like Judaism, was a communal thing, and I mean the earliest Christians came out of Judaism into Christianity, right? And so they kept many of the Jewish traditions and practices, and they were very communal in nature, and the church was very communal in nature up until really about the time of the Industrial Revolution. And especially in America, you had a number of Christian theologians promoting the individual relationship with God over the community's relationship with one another and with God in that covenant. And so it's a big issue as well in Christian churches today, going, well, it's not just about you and God, it's about you and God and everyone else in the congregation that you're a part of the congregation with. So yeah,
So
it's
parallel journeys for American Christians and Jews.
indeed. Yeah. And, individuality, it's really detrimental to, I think, a good, healthy understanding of what it means to be human. Because I think you would probably agree that God created humanity to be a community, right? I mean, he tells Adam in the garden, go multiply and fill the earth, make a community, be a community, do life together. The
Yeah,
whole idea of putting humanity on the earth is to be a community of stewards of God's planet.
that's right.
So, what do you say that Judaism teaches about, say, salvation? What happens? How does one become saved or enter into covenant with God?
Um, we certainly have the concept of salvation,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but it gets told communally. So the redemption from Egypt, the Hebrew words to describe it they are the word salvation, that we
Mm-hmm.
were taken from slavery to freedom. And then the belief in Judaism is that someday God will redeem the world through the Messiah. But it's not really an individual process. It's something we'll
Mm-hmm.
experience together.
Yeah, it's more of a communal redemption.
Yes.
What would you say typically would you say happens to someone at, say, death?
We have very little about the afterlife in our theology. We have some concepts. You know, the Bible describes Sheol, some sort
Mhm.
of shadow world. And because Jews were living among cultures that did believe in an afterlife, you'll see references in the Talmud to Olam Haba, the world to come.
Mhm.
When you get into the mystical side of Judaism, into Kabbalah, there is some reference to reincarnation. But we don't have a clear picture of the afterlife in Judaism. It's really focused on how are we living our life today to make God's world a better place and uphold our end of the covenant.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, that sort of leads into what you might think about, say, the concept of sin. And I'm sure sin plays into how you consider how you live today. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Jews don't believe in the concept of original sin.
Hmm.
We think that like one of the prayers we say in the very early morning is, God, the soul you've given me is pure. And we pray 3 times daily, and that's one of the first prayers we say.
Hmm.
There is the idea, though, that humans err, that humans miss the mark. So we call that a chet, and we believe in a process that's called tshuva. Um, the Hebrew word literally means return. And
Hmm.
so the concept is we're supposed to walk with God. That's what the word halacha or is. A lot of Jews call halacha Jewish law, but it actually means walking. So we're
Hmm.
supposed to walk with God. Sometimes we get lost, we get on the wrong path. That's a sin. But we always have the ability as an individual, there's no mediary, to return to the path that God wants us to walk. And there's one holiday a year that we really emphasize that, which is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
Hmm.
But in truth, built into the 3 daily prayers is a little paragraph about tshuva. And so 3 times a day, if you manage to do something wrong between breakfast and lunch, there's an opportunity to say, you know what? I regret doing that. I want to make amends and I want to get back on the path.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I guess we have a perpetual cycle of falling away and returning back.
Hmm. Yeah, what we typically would say in Christianity, right, is that when you sin, when you do something outside of God's will, it affects your ability to be in good fellowship with God, right? And so
Yeah.
we don't say you've lost your salvation, but what we say is um, you're in a position where you and God are not really on good terms, right? And so you confess your sins to say, look, God, I'm in agreement with you that my actions were outside of your will for my life. And because of that, I'm confessing that I was wrong to sort of help get us back into proper fellowship to continue moving forward again.
Yeah. It sounds like we have a similar process.
Yeah. Well, with with all we've talked about today, I think I want to just ask a couple more quick questions. And one is, what are some of the big ethical concerns of Judaism for our culture today?
Um, so the Talmud, this
Hmm.
other sacred book, it is pages of conversations between the rabbis trying to decide how to interpret God's words.
Hmm.
And they argue, but they argue for the sake of heaven, meaning they argue to reveal God's truth. And so they record minority opinions in this book. The Talmud isn't about, okay, here's the final ruling, and that's the only thing we're going to record in this story. It
Uh-huh.
records the actual conversations that happened and the people that disagreed, and it's done in a very intense way. People had strong feelings about how to interpret the law, but it's done in a respectful way.
Hmm.
And so, one of the things Jews are concerned about in the ethics of our culture today is that the whole world seems to have lost its ability to disagree in a productive and respectful manner.
Oh yeah, definitely so. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing these videos is to help people have examples of how if we with different faiths can talk about things, even if we don't see eye to eye on everything, that it's hopefully encouraging for people to go, oh, maybe I can actually get along with people I don't agree with. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, very good. One sort of last question is with regards to the state of Israel. I know that different Jewish groups have sort of different thoughts on the state of Israel and what should be done there, and or how we should view that. What are some of your thoughts on um, the state of Israel and what Jews need to know about how to think about the state of Israel today?
We have a wide range of beliefs. And again, that will be a distinction often between Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Jews. There are Jews that hold that God promised that land to the Jewish people. End of discussion. It belongs to the Jews. There are Jews that say, well, yes, but God also wants us to see the value of every human being and the human rights violations occurring for the Palestinian population and the foreign workers in Israel who come from Africa and Asia. That's also a concern to the Jewish people. So there's a tension between being a light unto the nation and how every resident who lives in the modern state of Israel is treated versus defending our security and right to exist in Israel. So personally, I believe that Jews do have a right to a sovereign state in Israel, and they also have a responsibility to be good stewards of all the residents of Israel.
That makes sense. So,
and again, it comes down to, can you hear each other's stories? And part of the problem in Israel right now is when people are wrapped up in their own version of the truth and can't hear the narrative of the other or the pain of the other on both sides, then there's no hope for coexisting in peace.
Yeah, very good. I think it's important, for people really to see the value in all human life. And it's important to recognize anytime people are being devalued or degraded as human beings and not heard. And, throughout all of the Hebrew scriptures, you see God taking the side of the poor and God helping those who are downtrodden and those who are just oppressed and abused and whatnot. And, it's important for us, if we say we're going to follow God today, that we also pay attention to the things that he's told us to pay attention to and has repeatedly paid attention to throughout his history with us. And so, so that's very good. Well, thank you so much for all that you've shared today. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. And I think this has been very educational, very helpful. And I hope that we can maybe discuss more sometime in the future.
Well, it was a real privilege to get to participate, and I think this is a wonderful project.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Well, everybody, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Faith and Culture Now.
Bye, everyone.